All right, diving in again. This time you've given us some pretty dense material. As always, though, the mission is to pull out the good stuff, the really important bits. We want to get you up to speed fast. And today we're looking at, well, a pretty influential thinker.
You could say that. You sent us to Joseph de Maistre, specifically his, well, I guess you could say pointedly titled Joseph de Maistre against Rousseau. It's a pretty strong critique of some of Rousseau's key ideas.
Against Rousseau, huh? Doesn't sound like he's pulling any punches. So what's Meister's approach here? How does he take on Rousseau?
He kind of comes at it from all sides, really. Throughout this work, he brings up historical examples, drawing on what happened in ancient Greece, Rome, even more recent European history. You'll see him using theological arguments, too, looking at things from this perspective of divine order. And I think, most importantly for this deep dive, he really digs into Rousseau's actual philosophical arguments. I mean, he challenges him on pretty much everything, from like the very nature of what it means to be human to the basis of how societies form.
Sounds like this is more than just a difference of opinion. This is like a head-on collision of two different ways of seeing the world. It's definitely a different view from a lot of those big Enlightenment ideas that honestly still shape so much of how we think today. But let's get right to it. Let's start with one of Rousseau's most famous ideas, the state of nature. How did Rousseau picture this pre-social existence?
So for Rousseau, the state of nature was this, well, hypothetical time before organized society. He imagined individuals living in this kind of, natural freedom and equality, mainly guided by instinct, self-preservation. No corruption from social stuff.
In Maistre, I'm guessing he wasn't buying it.
Not really, no. Maistre argues that this whole picture of, like, solitary humans before society is just way too vague, not well defined at all. And most importantly, he says there's just no real historical evidence for it. He basically says, look, everywhere we look, even in the earliest records we have, humans are already living in some kind of social groups. He completely flips the Enlightenment script. Maestre's saying that being part of the society is our natural state, not some kind of chosen contract.
So even those societies that, we might call primitive today, Maistre sees them as already having these complex structures. He doesn't see them as being anywhere near Rousseau's idealized state of nature, with everyone just running around on their own, right?
Yeah, exactly. He keeps pointing out that even these societies have, intricate customs, really deep-rooted traditions, these established forms of social organization. He even uses the example of the idea of law, right? Like the idea that killing someone is wrong and deserves punishment that exists in custom way before it's written down as a formal law.
That's a pretty interesting point. This idea that these really basic rules about how we treat each other, these unwritten rules, they actually come before any kind of legal system. It kind of suggests that there's some kind of built-in social order that we're already part of.
Right. And Maistre sees these customs, the fact that they stick around for so long,
Yeah.
as strong evidence that there's always been this kind of, social fabric. As for his overall opinion of Rousseau's work, well, he doesn't hold back. He basically calls it a jumbled mess of inconsistencies. He even compares it to pieced and tattered rags.
Okay, wow. Not pulling any punches there. Now, there's this other concept that Maistre brings up, which I found pretty interesting. He talks about nature as a kind of secondary force. Can you break that down a bit? What's he getting at?
Yeah, so Maistre believes that ultimately the highest power, the ultimate authority, is divine will. But he says in our everyday experience, the universe seems to work through something we understand as nature. Like it's not always God directly stepping in for every little thing. It's more like this set of laws and forces, this kind of system that's carrying out that divine will. It's like God's not micromanaging, but the big plan is still in action.
He uses Cudworth's plastic force as an example to help explain this. Could you unpack that a little bit? What's the connection there?
Right. So Ralph Cudworth, this philosopher back in the 17th century, he talked about this plastic force as this kind of inherent power inside matter itself that guides natural processes.
Yeah.
It helped explain how the natural world is so organized and complex, without needing God to be constantly stepping in and making every little adjustment. Maitre's using this as a parallel. He's saying there are these fundamental forces working in the universe, and they're distinct from God, but ultimately they're still guided by that divine intelligence.
And it's so interesting how that connects to the way we talk every day, right? We say things like nature wants or nature heals. We almost talk about nature like it's a person.
Yeah, and Maistre's point is that it's not just a figure of speech. He thinks it shows this really deep down understanding that we all have of nature as this active force that, shapes and influences things. But he's very clear that the secondary force, this nature, is still carrying out the will of what he calls infinite intelligence.
Okay, that makes sense. So we see how Maistre views nature, but he also makes this really strong argument about how humans are naturally social beings, which is the opposite of Rousseau's idea of the solitary individual. What's at the heart of Maistre's argument here?
It boils down to this. Maistre says, look at history, look at all the evidence. Humans are social creatures, period. Every record we have from the very beginning shows humans living in societies. So he's not saying society is something we invented later on. He's saying it's the basic condition of being human.
So, when we hear stories about people living in isolation, about savages living completely on their own, Maester sees those as exceptions, as outliers. He doesn't think those stories tell us much about what it really means to be human, right?
Exactly. He sees those cases as, anomalies. They don't really help us understand the core of human nature. He even says, hey, if you want to argue that humans once lived completely outside of society, you need to prove it. The burden of proof is on you. It's an extraordinary claim.
And he talks about the traditions of those really ancient cultures, like the Egyptians and the people in the Orient. What's the point he's making when he brings those cultures up?
He's pointing out that they're really old traditions, they're myths. They often talk about this time when gods ruled before humans. But, and this is key, they don't really have stories about humans living as, primitive animals. They don't have that in their popular traditions. And Maester thinks those long-held, widespread traditions, they hold some kind of basic truth.
It's an interesting way to think about it. Like, these myths that have stuck around for so long, they might actually be reflections of some sort of collective memory of the past. And there's that story he tells, too, about the so-called savage man and the bones of his ancestors. That really highlights this deep connection to community, right?
Yeah, it's a really striking anecdote. This guy, even though he's considered a savage, he refuses to move the remains of his ancestors. It shows this profound sense of connection to place, to his people, to this inherited tradition. And it's important to note that this is happening in a society that we might consider, at a very basic level of development. But even there, these social bonds, this sense of belonging, they're really deeply rooted.
And what about language itself? Mace just sees that as another piece of evidence that we're inherently social, right?
Absolutely. He says speech is as essential to humans as flying is to birds. It's not something we learn to do so much as something we're made to do. He sees it as tied to our social nature, this basic need to communicate and connect within a community. He's saying we're built for it, and as soon as our biology allows, we do it, just like a bird will naturally take flight once its wings are strong enough.
Okay, so we're getting this really clear picture of Maester's view of human nature, but he doesn't stop there. He also gets into this complex idea of how good and evil are kind of bound up together inside us. What can you tell us about that?
Right, so Maistre sees humanity as this, profound mystery. We're full of contradictions, these inner forces pulling us in different directions. He has this famous line, man is obliged to hate himself in order to esteem himself, which really captures that tension. He believes there are these two fundamental forces at work within us.
He talks about it like there are two laws inside us, each pulling us in opposite directions, one toward virtue and the other toward corruption.
Exactly. He thinks we have this innate moral sense, this capacity to recognize what's right, what's our duty, what's virtuous. But at the same time, there's this other powerful force that pulls us towards evil, towards self-destruction. And he brings in all these different historical figures like Ovid, St. Paul, Xenophon, Epictetus to back this up. He's showing how this idea of corruption of human nature, it's a universal thing. It's been recognized across different cultures and times.
But that seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? He says, men are evil, but man is good. How does that even work?
Yeah, it's subtle. What he's saying is that, theoretically, humanity as a whole might have the potential for goodness. But in reality, individual people, the men we actually encounter in the world, they're constantly prone to evil.
Yeah.
It's a bit of a warning, to be realistic about how people actually behave.
And he doesn't think societal institutions are the only reason for evil, right? He brings up examples like children betraying their parents and people stealing, even when they don't have to. What's his point there?
He's saying that even without specific societal structures, even without things that we think of as being unfair, some bad things like betrayal, theft, that kind of stuff, it would probably still happen. He's suggesting it comes from something deeper, something in our nature. He even brings up the idea of private property, something that Rousseau and Locke thought was really important for society. Maistre suggests that could actually be a source of conflict, too.
So even with laws and rulers in place, Maestre's not saying society will automatically be peaceful. It seems like he sees it as this constant potential battleground.
Exactly. He says that even with these systems to keep order, society is still a place where conflict can easily break out. He sees governments and leaders, like magistrates, as constantly having to step in to stop violence. And he uses revolutions, all the chaos and bloodshed that comes with them, as evidence of how fragile things really are.
And he divides human nature into these three parts: understanding, reason, and will. And he says the will is the one that's really messed up, right?
Yeah. He says our ability to understand and reason, they can be limited, weak. But the will, he says, that's fundamentally broken. It leads us to do things that are bad for us, even when we know better. It's like this deep wound in our nature.
I always think about that story he tells about the two robbers. They're arguing about how to divide up the loot they just stole. It's like, even when they're doing something bad, this sense of fairness of what's right, it still pops up.
That's a really powerful image. It shows how this innate sense of conscience, it's still there, even in the middle of something evil. It might be faint sometimes, but it's a part of us.
Okay, so let's move on to how Maistre critiques popular sovereignty and the social contract. That's a big part of Rousseau's thinking. What are Maistre's main problems with these ideas?
Well, he thinks there's this fundamental flaw in the whole concept of the people are sovereign.
Hmm.
He says, okay, sovereign over what? If the people are sovereign over themselves, doesn't that mean they're both commanding and obeying? He says that just doesn't logically work. It's a contradiction.
And he really doesn't seem to buy into the idea of representative democracy either. He has that example, which is almost funny, of French citizens briefly becoming king for a short time every few thousand years.
Right, that's Macer's way of pointing out how ridiculous he thinks the idea is that everyone can actually exercise sovereignty through voting and representatives. He's saying, in reality, most people are always going to be subjects, not rulers.
And he completely rejects the whole idea of a social contract, this idea that we all agreed to give up some freedom in exchange for security.
Yeah, he throws that out the window. He thinks it's just a made-up story, this hypothetical agreement that never actually happened. He says the social state isn't a choice, it's just a natural part of being human.
So, to go against Rousseau's idea of this pre-social state, Maistre gives us his own definition of nature. What's he talking about when he says nature?
So for Maistre, nature is the whole system. Everything, all the laws, the forces, the connections that make up the universe. And the nature of anything specific, like a person, is basically all of its essential qualities, the things that make it what it is. So when he talks about human nature, he's saying that based on history, based on everything we've seen, humans are naturally intelligent, religious, and social.
So he's saying that this whole idea of social order, it's not something we made up and agreed to, it's just woven into who we are as humans.
Right. And he's really critical of Rousseau for trying to prove that social order comes from a social contract. He sees it as this, philosophical mistake, denying something that's obvious, our social nature, to try and explain something that, in his view, doesn't really exist, this social contract.
Which leads us to Maistre's ideas about sovereignty and national character. He sees both of those things as coming from God, right? How does he connect those ideas? They seem pretty different at first.
So, Maistre believes that the same power that set up the basic rules of society, the same divine will, also decided what kind of government and rulers would work best for each nation. He's saying different nations need different forms of sovereignty to thrive.
He talks about nations being like people, being born and dying and having these special figures, these fathers or founders. Why are these founders so important to him?
He sees founders as these crucial people who have this deep understanding of their nation, this almost instinctive grasp of their people's character. They shape the nation's development, set down the basic principles that make that nation what it is.
And what about this idea of a common soul, this moral unity within a nation? How does Maistre think that develops and survives?
He sees language as the main thing that holds a nation together. It's how they share their identity, their moral understanding. He even brings in St. Paul, who said that God set the boundaries of nations. It's like their destinies are ordained.
So Maistre doesn't think nations just decide randomly who they are and what they'll be. They're actually trying to fulfill this destiny that's been set for them.
Yeah, and when nations come into contact with each other, sometimes they mix, they blend, and that can create new nations with different levels of strength and stability depending on how compatible their basic principles are.
Like he uses that example of the Vendée uprising during the French Revolution, right? How those people resisted being forced into a system that didn't fit them.
Exactly. For Maistre, that uprising, it shows this idea of a nation within a nation, a group of people with a strong shared identity, fighting against this dominant force that's trying to change them. It really shows how powerful national character can be, especially when it's being threatened.
So to bring it back to the social contract, Maistre thinks it's all just an illusion because he believes that the forms of government are really determined by God, based on all these factors: morality, geography, even things like how a nation does business.
Right. And he says that despotism, for example, might be totally natural and legitimate for one nation, while democracy works perfectly for another. It all depends on what God has ordained for them. He even criticizes Rousseau for contradicting himself about freedom and whether it's actually good for every single nation.
Let's talk about Master's idea of what a legislator, a founder of a nation, should be like. How does he differ from Rousseau's idea of the perfect lawgiver?
Well, Rousseau thought the ideal legislator was this almost mythical being with superhuman intelligence, someone completely detached from all the normal passions and desires. Maistre, on the other hand, he thinks a founder is more grounded, more practical, someone with common sense who's often guided by this sort of, infallible instinct, not by abstract theories.
Maistre is pretty skeptical of Rousseau's ideas about, completely changing human nature and creating a society from scratch through legislation.
Yeah, he thinks those ideas are unrealistic, like trying to build castles in the clouds. They're doomed to fail. He does say that Rousseau sometimes hits on some truths, but overall, Maistre sees his systems as flawed. He thinks Rousseau's too proud, too eccentric in his approach to philosophy.
Maistre believes that the moral unity of a nation, that shared sense of right and wrong, comes from a single source, a kind of founding influence. It's almost like a genetic code passed down from this one person.
That's a great way to put it. He uses this analogy from biology, comparing it to the work of Bonnet, who studied animal bodies. Maistre saying each nation gets its dominant traits from one originating man, one powerful, influential figure.
And how that founder creates a nation, how he passes down that character and temperament, Maistre says it's a mystery. It's something we can't fully explain rationally.
Right. It's like this amazing thing how one person can shape an entire people so deeply. He compares it to how a nation's history is written in its language. It's that deep, that fundamental.
So Meister's saying that a nation doesn't create its government any more than it consciously creates its language.
Exactly. He sees the founder as this, skillful hand that can sense the hidden potential, the special qualities that are already there in the people. And the founder brings that to life. Not so much through writing laws, but through actions, through leadership, through this deep influence.
He even goes as far as saying that these founders have a sort of divine mission. They've been given this extraordinary power by God. He makes it clear that they're not just tricksters or con men.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
He thinks they have a special calling, a divine mandate. And he also says that true constitutional institutions, the ones that last, they're not about creating new rights. They're about defending the ones that already exist.
He uses the Roman tribunes and the development of liberty in England as examples of this, right?
Right. Those institutions, they came about to protect freedoms that people already understood and practiced. He even points to the English monarchs, some of whom were conquerors. But even they, in Maistre's view, helped to build English liberty. It's like those rights and freedoms were already there, even before the laws were written down.
So let's talk about how Maistre views religion and politics. He's a big believer in having a very close connection between those two, right?
Huge believer. He thinks the strongest and most successful political systems are the ones that are deeply tied to religion. He sees them as going hand in hand.
Hmm.
Religion gives authority to the government, and the government supports and protects the religion. It's a mutually beneficial relationship.
And he uses Lycurgus and Sparta as a prime example. Their whole system of law was based on oracles, and the government was practically a religious order.
Exactly. For Maistre, Sparta is like the perfect model because they wove religion so deeply into their laws and government. He even talks about that time when Lysander tried to bribe the Spartan priests. He was trying to weaken the monarchy, and that shows just how important the religious figures were in that system.
And the Romans, too. Cicero had that famous line about how the Romans were great at everything, but they really excelled in their piety, their reverence for the gods. That was a really important point for Maistre, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. He really believed that the Romans' respect for the divine, all their careful rituals and religious practices, those were key to their success and how long they lasted as a civilization. Even the augurs, those guys who interpreted omens, Maistre saw them as playing a role in keeping things stable. Even if their teachings sometimes benefited the aristocracy, their whole role emphasized this deep respect for the divine. It kind of put a check on political recklessness.
He also talks about how the Romans treated the praetorium, the general's tent, with a lot of reverence, almost like it was a sacred space. And he mentions how they used religious symbols like eagles and banners in both military and political settings.
All of that just underscores how deeply intertwined religion was with the Romans' exercise of power, both in war and in peace. And for Maistre, even though he acknowledges that religion can be abused in politics, he still maintains that a strong connection between those two is absolutely crucial for a society to be stable and successful.
Now, Maistre has some interesting ideas about laws themselves. He notices this trend in the Roman Republic. Early on, they had very few laws, but as the Republic declined, they made more and more laws.
Yeah, he brings up that quote from Tacitus, "The worst republics have the most laws." Maitre's interpretation is that when you see a ton of laws being made, it's often a sign that society is breaking down, not getting stronger. It's like a symptom of weakness.
He also says that the way power was initially divided in Rome between the Senate and the people, that was basically set up by nature, by the circumstances they found themselves in.
Right. Those were the basic forces at play. And he thinks that when you divide sovereignty like that, you're kind of setting yourself up for conflict and instability. He suggests that you often need a third power, a strong unifying force like a hereditary monarch, to keep things balanced. He sees a lot of Roman history as this constant power struggle because of that divided sovereignty.
And in England, he says the laws exist because they're free, not the other way around.
Exactly. He even quotes a member of parliament who said that the English Constitution wasn't something they just dreamed up. It came from experience, from how they lived and governed themselves. The point is, for Maistre, the freedom of the English people came first, and the laws came after that, to reflect and protect that freedom.
Now, Maistre is very critical of what he calls revolutionary attempts at social engineering. He uses the example of the French National Convention, trying to set up this big national education system, as a prime example of how arrogant and out of touch revolutionaries can be.
He really goes after them on this. He thinks their whole plan was completely unrealistic, full of these logistical problems and social issues that they just completely ignored.
He even brings up the Jacobins, who were even more radical. They had this wild idea of using education to create a nation of gods.
Yeah. It's a bit crazy, right? It shows how these revolutionary thinkers, they were so idealistic, so ambitious, they really thought they could completely transform human nature and society through these massive social programs. And Maistre saying, you can't just reshape people like that. It doesn't work that way.
He picks apart their plan, pointing out all these details they messed up, like how many teachers they'd need, how much they'd have to pay them, the whole plan to house them in old presbyteries, even noting the fact that men and women would be living and working together, which was a big deal back then.
Right, and he's saying, look, they just didn't think things through. They were so focused on this grand vision that they missed all the practical problems. Like,
Yeah.
there weren't even enough presbyteries, and the ones that existed were often run down. The whole thing just wasn't feasible.
He then compares this revolutionary failure with how successful Ignatius of Loyola was in founding the Jesuit order. Ignatius started with a small group and was driven by deep religious conviction, and he created this lasting global institution.
For Maistre, the Jesuits are the perfect example of how to build something that lasts. They had strong moral and religious foundations, and they were effective in what they set out to do, whether it was education, spreading their faith, or even fighting against heresy. They did it all, even while facing serious opposition.
He even mentions how Frederick the Great, when they kicked the Jesuits out of Spain, said it was a victory against superstition. He's showing that people had really different opinions about the Jesuits.
Exactly. But even though the Jesuits were controversial, Maistre clearly admired them, especially how tough and resilient they were. He contrasts them with the Jansenists, whom he saw as being a lot more opportunistic, especially during the French Revolution.
And Maistre ends this whole section by throwing down a challenge to those all-powerful legislators of France.
Yeah.
He says, go ahead, try to create even one single primary school that everyone accepts and that actually lasts. He's questioning whether philosophy by itself can really build something that endures.
He's pointing out this fundamental weakness in revolutionary thinking. They're great at coming up with big ideas, but they're not so good at making those ideas a reality, something that people will actually embrace and support in the long run.
Okay, so that takes us to Maistre's views on reason and tradition. He's pretty skeptical of the idea that reason alone can solve all our problems, right? He thinks tradition and religion are way more important.
Yeah, he's very skeptical of reason as the be-all and end-all. He even brings up Frederick the Great, who complained that he could hardly find 3 philosophers who agreed with him, even though Ignatius of Loyola managed to get 12 devoted followers right from the start. He's saying reason alone can't really guide people or build lasting institutions.
Maistre does admit that reason has its place, especially in science and practical matters. But when it comes to morality and big social questions, he thinks it can be unreliable, even dangerous. He says that people's individual reasoning often ends up twisting and corrupting established moral principles.
He basically thinks that the wisdom we've inherited through tradition, along with the moral guidance we get from religion, that's a much safer and more reliable foundation than just letting everyone reason things out for themselves.
Mhm.
And he points out how even Rebot de Saint-Étienne admitted that Voltaire's writings helped to spark the revolution.
For Maistre, both Voltaire and Rousseau, even though they might have had some good ideas, they actually helped to cause the French Revolution. Voltaire by undermining political systems through, corrupting morals. And Rousseau by undermining morals through his radical political ideas.
That's his take. He sees them as two of the key figures who created this intellectual climate that led to all the chaos and violence of the revolution. Even if they had some good points, the overall effect of their work, according to Maistre, was negative.
And he's really adamant that religion and patriotism are essential for any society to be stable. He says true patriotism is inseparable from religion, that it weakens when religious faith declines.
He believes that when people believe in God, it gives them a sense of purpose, makes them more resilient, more creative. It's like this energy that flows into everything they do. He even uses Rousseau's own example of how Greece flourished during times of war. Maistre says it wasn't the war itself that caused that flourishing, it was the strong religious faith and the intense patriotism of that time.
And he draws this big contrast between the great thinkers of the 17th century, who he says were respectful of laws, both civil and religious, and the much more radical, audacious thinkers who came after them during the Enlightenment.
He sees that shift as a really dangerous turn, like they abandoned the accumulated wisdom of the past and embraced these radical, ultimately destructive ideas that tore down the foundations of society.
Okay, so now let's dive into how Maistre critiques those core revolutionary ideals, liberty, equality, popular sovereignty. How does he view those things?
He's not a fan of how those concepts were interpreted and used during the revolution. He points to Size, who said the people always have the right to change or even completely throw out their contract, their agreement with the government, and start over. Maistre thinks that kind of thinking is incredibly dangerous. It just leads to instability.
He also brings up Rousseau's idea that laws always benefit the people who have property and harm those who don't. Rousseau's implying that society itself is inherently unfair unless we have some kind of radical redistribution of wealth, right?
Right. And Master thinks statements like that are really problematic. They just create this constant sense of unrest and resentment. He's also very critical of Rousseau's concept of absolute popular sovereignty. The idea that the people have unlimited power to change laws, even fundamental ones, and can even choose to harm themselves. Master thinks that's reckless and dangerous.
And he says that these kinds of revolutionary ideas, they basically empower the worst elements in society. He even says that without these ideas, people like Marat and Robespierre, those really radical figures, they probably would have remained insignificant.
Yeah, he thinks these ideas take the lid off of people's passions and create this environment where extremism and violence become acceptable, even justified in the name of these abstract principles.
And he also takes on this idea that the sovereign power, the ultimate authority, can be judged or limited by law.
Yeah.
He thinks that's a contradiction, that it just doesn't make sense logically.
Right. He says if something has the power to judge or limit the sovereign, then that thing is the real sovereign. He uses the example of the division of powers in England. The king, the lords, and the commons, they each have veto power. But that's it. They can block each other, but they can't formally judge or punish each other.
So for Maistre, a true sovereign power, even if it's spread out among different branches of government, can't be judged, removed, or punished by any law, because anything that has the power to do those things would actually be the real sovereign.
Exactly. It's like a fundamental rule of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And he says, when it comes down to it, your choices are basically to obey the sovereign or to rebel against them. He does acknowledge, though, that some people argue that a republic or a government with checks and balances might lead to more sensible and responsible decisions by the sovereign.
So now let's get into how Maistre compares different forms of government. He definitely has a favorite, right?
He does. He thinks hereditary monarchy is much better than elective monarchy, mostly because it's more stable, less likely to get bogged down in all that fighting and chaos that comes with elections. He makes a similar point about aristocracy, saying hereditary is better than elective there too. He even quotes Tacitus, who said, "It is better to accept a sovereign than to look for one."
And he argues that hereditary aristocracy can actually be good for the ordinary people because even though power is concentrated, it tends to be less demanding and less extravagant than other systems.
Right. He contrasts that with Rousseau, who really hated hereditary aristocracy. Rousseau called it the worst of all governments. Maistre thinks Rousseau was just angry at anyone who was born into a higher social position, that he had this kind of plebeian anger against the upper class. Maistre, on the other hand, sees it as wise and even admirable to willingly submit to those natural social distinctions.
He also says that hereditary aristocracy works especially well in smaller states. He uses those examples of Lucca and Ragusa, which were relatively peaceful and happy republics, and compares them to Geneva, which had a much more turbulent democracy.
Yeah, he's trying to show that different systems of government work better in different contexts. It's not like democracy is always the best choice.
And Maistre believes that pure democracy, where everyone has an equal say, is just a fantasy. It doesn't exist in the real world, just like a society where everyone is purely voluntarily associated also doesn't exist. He thinks that as you move away from everyone having equal power, you naturally end up with more concentrated sovereignty.
Right. And he also says that there's this kind of divine element in the spirit of voluntary association that you see in republics. But he still maintains that for any government to actually function, power has to end up in the hands of a smaller group.
Now, some people argue that in monarchies, talented individuals can be overlooked or even suppressed. Maistre addresses that concern, but he doesn't think it's an inherent flaw in monarchy itself. He blames it more.